gracious moment. I want to talk about Judas Iscariot this morning, in case you couldn't figure that out. And maybe this seems like an odd topic so soon after the joy of Resurrection Sunday on Easter, but I think Judas is a really interesting person to talk about. I read an article by Reverend Jeremy Smith on his website, hackingchristianity.net. Pastor Jeremy asked an interesting question about Judas. What was it that turned Judas against Jesus? Every gospel treats Judas just a little bit differently, as we heard in the scripture readings this morning. The Gospels, according to Matthew and Mark, write that Judas was motivated by silver and greed, while the authors of Luke and John say that Satan tricked Judas or took over Judas. John includes a line where Jesus tells Judas to go and betray him. And you know, Judas even dies differently. In Matthew, Judas hangs himself in shame, while in Acts, Judas trips in the field he bought with his blood money and injures himself in a way only suitable for the TV show The Walking Dead. Now, that's Pastor Jeremy's line because I've never seen The Walking Dead, but I read the passage and it's a pretty gory death, let me tell you. When I read about Judas, I think of that passage in Luke 22, 1-6, where it says that Satan entered Judas. He went and talked to the chief priests about how he could hand Jesus over to them, and they were delighted and arranged payment for him. He agreed, and he began looking for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them, a time when the crowds would be absent. It seems like, from this passage, maybe Judas was minding his own business, and then Satan enters into him. Yet Judas doesn't appear to become like the demon-possessed folks elsewhere in the scriptures. Judas seems to have kept his sensibilities. So we aren't talking about a demon possession where Satan overpowers Judas's facilities. And I keep thinking that the word Satan in Aramaic means crazy thoughts. I have a book at home by an Aramaic scholar, and that's what he says. That word Satan in Aramaic means crazy thoughts. Could Judas have been taken over by his own crazy thoughts? Could he have willingly followed what his own crazy thoughts told him to do? Did Satan, his own crazy thoughts, convince Judas to turn against the most powerful and wonderful person on earth, whose miracles Judas saw with his own eyes, whose wisdom Judas knew intimately? What could Satan, those crazy thoughts, have possibly said to Judas to turn him in the face of that proven power and authority? One clue might be that Judas was Jewish. He participated in the Passover meal along with all the other disciples who were all Jewish. Judas more than likely grew up going to the synagogue and hearing the stories of the faith, especially the stories of the patriarch of Judaism, Abraham. Abraham and Sarah were quite old when God blessed them with Isaac, their only son. Judas would have heard the most dramatic story of Abraham over and over in the synagogue. It's found in Genesis 22, where God told Abraham to take Isaac up to the top of a mountain and sacrifice him. Abraham took Isaac up that mountain, tied him to the sacrificial pyre, and had a knife in his hand when God intervened and stopped him. Isaac lived, and Abraham was rewarded for his faith by becoming the patriarch of the chosen people of God. Judas knew this story. He had to know it in his bones and be able to recite it word for word. Peter Rollins, an Irish theologian, believes that the story of Abraham was reenacted by Judas in a way that went tragically wrong. From his book, The Fidelity of Betrayal, Rollins writes, "It said that Abraham acted with absolute fidelity to the call of God, that despite his deep love for Isaac and his sense of correct ethical conduct, Abraham was prepared to follow the direction of God, regardless of the consequences. Although Abraham loved his son and believed that he was to be the seed through which his descendants would enter into the world, Abraham obeyed God and resolved in his heart to commit the murder. So I wonder if Jesus thought he was being told by God to give Jesus up so that Jesus could become who Judas thought he was, the mighty King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Perhaps Judas thought he knew how that story would work out. Jesus would save himself when the Romans took him into custody. He would reveal himself as the warrior king, the Messiah, and the empire would be vanquished. Judas would have proven his worth as Abraham did, willing to sacrifice their one hope. Judas would have been the most faithful disciple there ever was. I wonder if that was the story ringing in his ears. Except that it didn't happen that way, and we know that. We know that Judas brought the soldiers to Jesus' camp, but instead of a dramatic reveal that overcame the empire with shock and awe, Jesus was arrested, crucified, and killed. The disciples scattered and afraid. It's little wonder that Judas would take his own life in the gospel according to Matthew. Jesus wasn't who Judas thought he was, not in the way Judas wanted him to be. The one who Judas loved was gone. Judas, if this is true, Judas got the story wrong. Judas was not meant to be the second Abraham. Jesus was meant to be the second Adam. The first Adam was made of dirt, and even though he sinned, God loved the one made from dust. The second Adam now, he was the one who would make things right, who would track dirt into the all-too-clean temples, past the whitewashed tombs of the Pharisees, and connect humanity with God directly again. Rather than a second story of a favored family made anew, it was a new story of the entire human condition made anew. The second Abraham was a failure. The second Adam was not. And I get this Judas. I don't get the Judas who was controlled by Satan or even gave up Jesus for some silver. Those don't make sense to me. But a human who fell into the trap of mistaking others' voices for the voice of God, that I can get. I also get how he could get caught up in a story that wasn't even his own. We all do it sometime or another in our lives. So we often betray our own lives by living into stories that are not our own. We believe we're supposed to be all things to all people, or we're supposed to be the super parent, the super partner, the breadwinner, the one who does everything as if there are 25 hours in a day, the one who hopes their talent will take them to the highest level of prestige. And when we don't make the list, when we don't get the promotion, when our children don't respond the way we expect and want them to, when our beloved seems even more distant, we wonder what went wrong. We can get so wrapped up in our own false stories that we forget who we are. Author Brian Doyle, editor of the Portland magazine, said, "Humility is the final frontier. We spend all of our lives building a persona. Lots of people get lost in the cells they build and are desperate to get out." How many of us, or people that we know, are lost in the cells that have been created, the stories that we listen to that are not true and want desperately to get out? How tragic is it that Judas got so lost in his image of who he thought Jesus was that he couldn't see the real Jesus. Rollins writes a haunting note in The Fidelity of Betrayal that will maybe strike you as much as it did me. Rollins writes, "One difference between Abraham and Judas is, of course, that Abraham receives Isaac back, while Judas fails to receive Jesus back. But surely this is because Judas dies by suicide before such an encounter can take place. Could reconciliation have happened had Judas not taken his own life and instead met the resurrected Jesus. We see that maybe the second Abraham and the second Adam could both have existed at that moment of reconciliation. Judas failed the test by at least 24 hours, probably more than that, since he had all of Holy Weekend to wait for the resurrection, but he didn't wait. If he had lived long enough to see the resurrected Jesus, would he have been venerated, forgiven? I don't know for sure. I know Peter was. I think Judas would have as well. And you know, I can't help but wonder how strong Abraham would have been if his knife had been unhindered and struck true. Would he have responded like Judas if his dream had been crushed, if his story hadn't matched reality, and if he was unable to get out of the swirling darkness of death? And will we? Can we get out of living the twin stories of Abraham and Judas? Did they both believe they were discerning God's still small voice amidst the chaos of life? Are we concerned that we'll mistake God's voice and live a story that isn't ours? That's a lesson from Judas that we can, perhaps, take to heart. In closing, I admit that as I pondered the next few things I want to share with you, I wasn't quite sure how they fit in with today's message. And then I realized that that's not quite true. I know out of my own life experience of the past week that they do fit. I've experienced a rupture in an important relationship, and I'm trying to live in the grace of these words I'm about to share. And I believe this quote and poem can be helpful for all of us at some point in our lives. I feel strongly called to share this quote and this poem with you. The first quote is by Nadia Bolz-Weber. I don't know if you're familiar with that name. She's a Lutheran pastor. She is tattooed all up and down her arms and her back. And once she really stepped into the Christian faith, she had them all redone, and they tell a Christian story now instead of what they told before. Nadia calls herself a pastrix instead of pastor for the female version of it. She's very outspoken, well-spoken, and she's becoming more and more known across the country for those outspoken ways. Nadia said, "I say to people at our welcome to house brunches, I'm glad you love it here, but at some point I will disappoint you, or the church will let you down. Please decide on this side of what's happening. Please decide on this side of that happening if you will stick around. Because if you leave, you will miss the way that God's grace comes in and fills in the cracks of our brokenness. And it's too beautiful to miss. Don't miss it." I thought about Judas as I read this quote this week. What if he had decided on the front side of the resurrection to stick around? What grace from God did he miss out on because he quit on life? What beautiful thing did he miss? I've decided to stay in this relationship to try to talk it out, to work it out, and see what beautiful thing God has for me and this other person on the other side. And then there's the poem titled Invitation to Brave Space by Mickey Scott Jones. It reads, "Together we will create brave space, because there's no such thing as safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars and we have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side." Judas didn't give that brave space a chance. He chose not to enter that space that's not safe, that's scary, but it is brave. He didn't talk about what was happening inside of him to others, and he didn't wait to face the consequences of his actions, consequences that turned out so important for the whole world in a beautiful way. Do we avoid that brave space, preferring the assumed safe space of our own thoughts, our own self-focused lives? Or do we bravely share our scars with others as we turn down the volume of the outside world, as we call one another to more truth and love? Can we start somewhere, like right now, right here, and continue to grow as we work on this side by side? Not being perfect, not having life or others be what we wish for, how we wish for them to be. Can we enter into this brave space together and work on being brave side by side? I've been seeking this brave space with others for a number of years now. I had it when I lived in Salina before I ever went off to seminary. There was a group of women who met monthly, and we talked honestly and bravely to each other about what was going on in our lives, in our heads, in our hearts. We didn't have a program to follow. We just sat and we talked. We slowed down. We listened to one another. We examined what we thought we knew in a group of faithful Christian women. And I've read of men doing the same thing. We are called to community as Christians, not to live our faith as lone rangers. We need to hear one another's stories, and we need to share our own stories. As we talk and listen and care and feel cared for by others, we are less likely to act in crazy thought ways like Judas did. And God can change our hearts in that brave space. Amen.